Excellent. Everyone can hear me? Good. Okay. So I just want to say welcome to my talk. I'm going to be talking about the pros and cons of learning with VR and AR. And before I start, I just want to send a real thanks to Mike McCready and Lethbridge College for putting this on. It's a really interesting new experience for me and also, I guess, for everybody else here. So it's really, really cool. So let me just start by saying, who am I? Well, my name is Connor Gottfried, and I'm the CEO of Leara eLearning. I'm sure I'm like most people in this room in that I'm fascinated with technology and virtual reality in particular. Just to give you a bit of background, when I was 5, in 1982, my parents brought home an Apple II computer, and right away I was hooked. Since then, I've gone on to found Leara eLearning, and we've developed an award-winning cloud-based e-learning authoring tool, and our clients have included NASA, CNRL, PCL, and the Ottawa Hospital. I've really always been fascinated with VR and its potential, and I was an early adopter. I've owned the DK1, the DK2, the Vive, the Rift, and the Gear, and even the Virtual Boy. Just like everybody here, I'm really excited about the future of VR as a medium for the creation of new experiences in education, entertainment, communication, medicine, and virtually every other human endeavor. Before I get into the content of my presentation, I just want to reinforce that this is a really rapidly evolving new medium, and the technology is changing quickly. New developments are being made every day. I'm an avid reader of Upload VR, Road to VR, and VR Scout, and VR is really in one of those most fascinating periods of technological development. So everything I say today may change rapidly as the sector evolves. So first, let's take a look at the history of VR in education. So VR as an education tool began in the 1960s and 70s with the use of flight simulators and head-mounted displays for the US Air Force. Since that time, there have been a number of studies relating to the use of VR in education, including McClellan, Youngblood, Chen, Galgarno, Hedberg, Harger, and Silverian. So I've incorporated some of their findings along with some of my own thoughts into this presentation. So the future of VR in education is extremely bright, and I'm going to highlight exactly why VR holds such promise, but I want to start with the cons just to get them out of the way. So these are all things we know as VR enthusiasts, but issues that will be solved in the coming years. So there's currently 2 sets of difficulties that are encountered when developing and delivering VR in education: issues for the end user and issues for the developer. So let's start with the end user. The primary issues facing those that want to consume VR content relate to access and complexity, comfort, feedback, and resolution. So access is currently one of the largest issues. So although there are 3 degree of freedom headsets that have fairly large penetration, so Gear VR, for example, in the range of 5 million delivered, supposedly, these headsets don't offer the full VR experience, and so by nature, they're limited to certain types of activities. Although they're relatively simple to operate, they still have problems like overheating and require learners to own certain models of smartphones. Most of the advantages of VR/AR training require the addition of 6 degree of freedom hand controllers. This technology currently requires fairly expensive computing equipment, and it's not a household item yet. This is going to change. For example, Oculus currently has the Santa Cruz standalone headset and controllers in development with 6 degree of freedom inside-out tracking for both the headset and controllers. So when 6 degree of freedom headsets are ubiquitous and learners can simply pick one up to use them, it's going to open the door for developers to reach these learners. Over time, the learners are going to become more at ease with using VR technology regardless of how it's delivered. Systems like Oculus Home or Viveport are simplifying the experience of accessing content from a software perspective, and the development of WebXR, for example, is going to make it easier for developers to create virtual reality, augmented reality experiences and deliver them outside of any particular ecosystem through a browser. So we're at the very beginning of the VR/AR journey, and Moore's Law has shown us that we can expect continued drastic improvements while decreasing the actual material used in the product. So I think the result is going to be something like a pair of glasses with retinal display, projection, and costing maybe around $50. And this is a product that eventually everyone is going to own. Another one of the current issues is comfort. So there are still issues with locomotion in VR and simulator sickness or nausea when experiencing certain types of comfort. So there are a variety of software and hardware solutions currently being developed to attempt to address these issues, including treadmills, software locomotion techniques, and restrictions to field of view during locomotion, like you might see in Google Earth. Another issue right now is the lack of haptic feedback. So sometimes the simulations would benefit greatly from haptic feedback. For example, surgical training would benefit greatly from the feeling of natural resistance as the person slices. And really, any training that requires a sense of touch is currently restricted by the lack of haptic feedback. For example, training someone how to cut hair or play piano or perform dental hygiene, just to name a few. So there are a number of haptic feedback mechanisms currently being tested that hold promise. Here's an example right here. The solution in the near-term future may be a full-body haptic suit with haptic gloves and a treadmill for locomotion. Resolution. So this is a hot topic right now with the Vive Pro and Pimax's successful Kickstarter campaign. The current resolution is really just the bare minimum, and it has a lot of drawbacks in the educational space. It's really especially true when it comes to text readability. So Google is going to be debuting a record-breaking pixels per inch display at a conference next month, and foveated rendering, if you're familiar with that, it's just around the corner, and supposedly Google's new display technology is leveraging this. So this might not be an issue for long. Just a side note here as well that some training information is not suited to 3D representation, for example, literature. There's really no advantage currently to reading text in VR, especially when considering the resolution limitations, but this may change quickly. VR and AR could be used to display contextual information while reading books. For example, it may be able to display highlights or notes, comments, questions and answers directly connected to text in something that you're reading. So I haven't seen this done yet, though. One other thing to note here is that the writing of long-form tests in virtual reality and augmented reality is currently more difficult. The lack of keyboard support makes text input really a lot more laborious, and is currently being in the process of being resolved by work in natural language processing. From the perspective of training developers, the primary issues right now are cost and complexity. So really cost to create content. This is the primary one as a development company. It's huge, and it's really the primary hurdle we need to get over to be able to bring VR and AR content into the mainstream. We need more effective world and scenario creation tools to build content. Ideally, the content creator will build in virtual reality using something like Tilt Brush or Google Blocks to create scenarios. There's actually a really interesting study that just was released that I'll tell you about here. So I think that what we're going to see is using natural language processing and artificial intelligence, and we're going to combine those to create natural language scenario building. So for example, somebody might say, while in VR, say, create an office front desk. This is scenario one, create a professionally dressed woman. The woman appears there. She is angry and has a customer service issue. She says the following, and AI and natural language processing, just to give you a little bit of background on this, it's actually being used right now to create Flintstones animations directly from natural language. So they trained an AI using existing animations, and then they were able to say things like, Pebbles is sitting at a table in the room watching the television, and the AI actually fully generated the cartoon from that. So I think what we're going to see is the development of scenario-based training that's purely created through natural language processing. In a few years, I think this technique is going to be much more sophisticated, and it's going to be able to be used to produce all kinds of content from scripts. That being said, though, compared with a development tool like our Respond 5 product, the cost to create virtual reality, augmented reality content is currently very, very high. So companies really need to have a specific business case that can't be met using e-learning or traditional training. But the development of tools, scanning systems, and AI is going to really greatly assist with this. Improved systems for importing CAD drawings, etc., will also simplify the process. And it's this continued evolution of tools that I believe will make it possible for even individuals to create sophisticated virtual reality or augmented reality e-learning content, I think within the next 5 years. So enough about the current problems, which are all going to be solved. That is a fact. Why and how is VR and AR going to change how we learn? Number one, immersion. So this is the obvious one. VR and AR is highly engaging and motivating, and studies have shown this has a positive effect on learning outcomes with learners. Emotions like fear, surprise, social pressure, etc., they can all be harnessed in VR or AR to create emotional connections during learning. Immersiveness can also be used to control cognitive load, and this is a huge one with training. So currently, VR can cause an increase in cognitive load due to the novelty of the experience and factors like simulator sickness, the complexity of teleportation and interaction. But in the long term, VR can be used to reduce cognitive load by providing clean learning spaces with no extraneous sensory information outside of the items employed in the learning experience. And really, conversely, some training might require increased cognitive load. For example, driver training where unexpected things are happening and there are kids in the back seat fighting, for example. Virtual reality can give us complete control over all of these elements. So the next one here is synthesis or constructivist learning. So constructivism as a learning theory, it posits that learning is an active, constructive process engaged in by the learner. So VR provides an excellent framework for constructivist learning. Currently, tools like, or games, for example, like Minecraft or Fantastic Contraption, these are excellent examples where learners are able to learn through the process of creation. This is already possible using 3D graphics on a traditional screen, but learning in 3D makes learned movements directly applicable to the real world if the real world behaviors are modeled appropriately. So studies show that a virtual environment can, and I'm quoting here, can stimulate learning and comprehension because it provides a tight coupling between symbolic and experiential information. And that's from Bowman, Hodge, Allison, and Weinman in 1998. So I think that's a really interesting one, that tight coupling between symbolic and experiential information. So VR and AR can provide true just-in-time, just-in-place training, and especially with AR. So the ability to overlay movement instructions on real equipment is going to be a major advantage. A simple example to understand is a barista. For example, the coffee machine company could provide a standardized package. The coffee machine company could provide a standardized package for whatever AR glasses become the standard. The barista could just load this up and select from instructions for a variety of common tasks. For example, making an Americano or performing equipment maintenance. And it would display it as overlaid instructions. When he or she gets home and they want to use their new washing machine, they can load the standardized washing machine package produced by Whirlpool, for example, for their machine. And they can see those instructions directly overlaid on the machine. For an even more powerful and common example, think about how you would assemble IKEA furniture using augmented reality. Once the tools and infrastructure are in place for a company like IKEA to easily create instructional augmented reality training, and the general public has access easily to augmented reality glasses, it's going to be a major step forward for training people how to do mechanical tasks. This also ties into testing for competency because 3D testing using AI is going to allow trainers to see closely and how closely a learner's movement matched an ideal movement. So it's much better for mechanical learning than 2D screens. Repetitive movement jobs may be on the way out with robotics and AI's growing role in manufacturing, but there's always going to be a place for 3D learning of tasks. So reaching learners, and this ties into a general point about VR education. When we think about VR education, because we're thinking about advanced technology, we tend to think about advanced education, for example, workplace training, advanced skills training, but there's a huge opportunity to improve how we handle training for youth, the elderly, disabled, or people who are bedridden. Youngblood's 1998 study showed the potential educational effectiveness of AR and VR for special needs students. For example, a tool like Google Earth can currently be used by someone who's not able to travel to educate themselves about the geography and cities of the world. VR is going to allow us to deliver first-person educational experiences to people all over the world and eventually to all economic groups as the cost comes down. It's going to democratize spatial learning experiences and first-person learning experiences. I'll cover some more applications in a minute, but this ties into location-based training. Real-world locations can be recreated in VR And learners can complete training in these locations without the need to physically be there. So, for example, offshore oil drilling rigs or training for astronauts who are on a mission to repair a satellite. In addition, reduced environmental impact. So virtual spaces consume very little physical resources to create, modify, and destroy. Destructive training is going to become much more cost effective. For example, driver training that involves reaction testing to crashing cars, or surgical training that involves non-reversible cutting can both be handled using VR with no physical consequences. One of the more interesting and unique areas where VR can play a role is with intimacy in social learning for soft skills. So, looking into someone's eyes as you respond in a difficult situation can be challenging for many people, and VR can provide a tool for people to train comfortably for these situations. This applies as well to training for public speaking, and there are currently apps that allow you to practice your talk in front of a boardroom or large event crowds. Interestingly, studies show the effect of being watched personally by the instructor, whether a real or a virtual character, and the effect of others paying attention in VR around you, whether real or virtual, resulted in improved learning outcomes. So these social effects could be harnessed with non-player characters to enhance attentiveness. When it comes to social learning with other human beings, using 2D screens has resulted in a decrease in people sharing time together. And instead, with VR, people are going to be returning to sharing a space together, just like we are right now. And so, in some way, it's actually a technological antidote to the technological problem of social isolation. We'll be coming back to the past where people spent time together and trained together, but now with the ability to choose how we represent ourselves and the environments that we train within. Another really interesting one is new visualization techniques. We currently use 2D projections predominantly in science to communicate visual information, charts, graphs, etc. 3D visualizations have been difficult to manipulate because they require complex mouse skills, and also they're then presented as 2D projections on a screen anyways. We have the ability to think and visualize in 3 dimensions, so it's a major advantage to use these dimensions in visualizing mathematical data. For example, consider how mathematical formulas and relationships can be visualized in 3D space, and how the positioning of the observer can be used to enhance retention through emotional reactions. For example, cliffs or approaching objects. Also consider how you might display higher dimensional space transformed into a 3D space and then visualized in virtual reality. It really makes me wonder if future generations are going to be able to understand and visualize 4 dimensional space after being exposed to visualizations of 4 dimensional space from childhood in virtual reality. So I see it like film, and just like film first looked at recreating plays, we're currently looking at recreating reality with virtual reality. In the same manner that film then started to explore situations and narrative techniques that had never existed previously, virtual reality will also do this. And in the future, we may see whole groups of people living in virtual reality worlds that from the outside seem very confusing, with their own visual languages and physics. After all, we are consciousnesses, and we've discovered the ability to create and curate our own experiences using virtual reality. Artists are going to be exploring this medium for the foreseeable future, and their work will result in entirely new ways of thinking that use VR, AR, AI, and social networking. To understand and work within these frameworks is going to require training that by necessity will take place using virtual reality and augmented reality. In AR, as AR and virtual reality becomes the dominant computing platform, VR and AR becomes the most effective method for training to use this platform. So as new modalities of interaction are created, it will become challenging to communicate or train on these modalities outside of VR and AR. The coming 5 years will see issues relating to access, complexity, comfort, feedback, and resolution resolved, and new sets of tools built to allow for greatly simplified creation of content. And really, the future is so bright, we got to wear our augmented reality shades. Any questions?
All right, it looks like we have a few questions. Let's start with Tyler here. Go ahead.
Sorry, again, this is the Oculus Rift problem, I think, something in Rumii. So, as far as what you're working on, how do you see education being both changed, but then more importantly, how do you change teachers and parents and just society in their thinking about education? Because it's one thing to come from within and say, here's how you can do it differently, but how do you change that mind shift in culture?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that the culture will slowly change itself. Young people are really fascinated by virtual reality, as we all know, and they're going to drive the transition to using virtual reality in all sorts of different life areas. Once they are presented with virtual reality opportunities that are equal to or greater than what they could receive outside of virtual reality, that's going to drive them to use virtual reality, and it's going to then expose older generations who maybe are slower on the uptake to give it a try. So I think, like I said earlier, we're just at the very beginning with this because most people's experience of virtual reality is a Gear VR, for example, which doesn't give you the full experience. And so I think, the creation of VR arcades and that type of thing are going to expand people's awareness of what VR can be. And then as the experience, as the market for it grows, then the market for developers is going to grow. And, it's just one of those situations where they both sort of have to grow one step at a time.
Awesome.
And it looks like we have a few more here, but first of all, let's look at this question from Twitch. It is, how long do you feel it will take for AR and VR to be widely adopted across education?
That's a really good question. I think that we're going to see a pretty solid adoption within 5 years, and that's going to be more in. I mean, the thing I guess with VR and AR in education is that it doesn't require educational institutions to adopt it. It just requires individual learners to have access to the equipment. So I think that that's a question that comes down to the adoption of VR equipment, and I think 5 years would be a reasonable time frame before we're seeing high quality VR really start to take off. In terms of when are we going to completely transform our educational system, well, I've been developing e-learning for 20 years, and we still have traditional universities and very few post-secondary e-learning options. So, that may be a much longer, slower process. But the ability to create content much more easily and the ability for people to access that content much more easily is going to really drive the growth. So I'm going to say 5 years, we're going to see a big shift from where we're at right now.
All right, and if there are any other questions here, don't forget to use the call for attention button, which is up on the top right corner of the screen. It's the exclamation mark icon, or if you're on VR, down in your tool belt below you. Looks like Tyler has another question, so go ahead.
Yeah, just if there's no one else here, I have one more question about that adoption into the systems. When do we transition from schools no longer worrying about the cost? And is that going to happen before, like I think you kind of made clear that you think everyone else is going to have a VR headset before all the schools have VR headsets for every student. But how do you see that transitioning where it's in the mass public? Some people have it, some people don't. And definitely a lot of people will never consider buying, at this point, a $2,000 computer to use a VR headset. When does this school end up taking over? Is there a price point or is it a societal thing?
Well, I think it's a combination of price point, content, availability and price, and then a societal shift once people start to realize, wow, this actually has huge potential for allowing our students to learn things they wouldn't otherwise learn. I think there's a bit of a bias against virtual reality right now in public education and post-secondary type institutions, because I've seen it with e-learning as well. So I think what needs to happen is that the content needs to prove itself as being equal to and available and more accessible or superior. And in terms of the price point of the headsets, we've got the Oculus Go coming out next month, or at least announcing the release of it. So we had some of these standalone headsets that are coming out that are around the $200 price point. So that's cheaper than even a tablet was a few years ago. And schools have had fairly wide adoption of tablets. So I think once we see a big player, like for example an Apple or a big publishing company, move into the space with high quality content, then that's going to drive adoption.